what is the relationship in the case of the Sudan between the cultural reality of the country, I'm not even sure I want to say country, and the diplomatic approach to the problems. But I think I have to give a measure of background to understand why there is such a gap between the cultural reality of things and the way the international community, and which was not the same, by the way, for a long time as it is now, handles the Sudan. Of course, this is something which goes way beyond what I'm saying about the Sudan. I'm sure you could say the same thing about Castro's Cuba, about Iran, about a whole number of situations which are diplomatically extremely difficult to handle, and which are seen with the eyes of the diplomatic actors and not taking into account the reality which is on the other side. I'm not saying that the reality on the other side is any better, but it is the reality, and often it is not seen. I would say that part of the problem is that the model, the diplomatic model, is one which was set up by the Treaty of Westphalia back in 1648. And there was a commonality of thinking. This was a number of people in Western Europe setting up the rules of the diplomatic game. And you look at all the treaties up to the Versailles Treaty in 1919, it is like that. You know, we know who we are, we know each other. Of course we disagree, we've been at war. But we also know how we're gonna make peace, because our vocabulary is common, our cultural references are the same, we belong to the same world. Now, this was the time either of the rest of the world is separate from Europe, or the colonial times right up to World War II. Since World War II, we're suddenly dealing at the international level with a radical heterogeneity of culture. And this is something we're often not prepared to do. The case of the Sudan, I think, is a beautiful example, although it is by far not the only one. I've divided my talk in three parts. What we can consider the cultural background, that is before 1956, before the independence of the Sudan. Dealing with the independent Sudan between 1956 and the Muslim Brother coup, and since 1989, dealing with the Muslim Brother government. And of course, the degree of heterogeneity increases just as the necessity of engagement becomes greater and greater. So, first of all, Sudan is not a country. Sudan is a space. And the very name, you know, it's not the name of something that is geographically identifiable. Beled al-Sudan, in Arabic, means the land of the blacks. And in terms of the Arabic geographers, it means anything that is south of the Sahara. You know, you can see in Arabic, Africa is like a cassetta. You know, there are layers, you know. First, you have the real place by the Mediterranean. Then you have a Sahara, with the desert, clear across, one layer. Then you have a Sahel, which means the shore in Arabic. You know what we call Sahel in English? In fact, it's the word, the Sahel is the shore, because the desert is like a sea. When you come across that sea of sand, you reach the shore. And then beyond that, you have Al-Balad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks. Again, they are human beings, you know, after crossing that. So the Sudan is not a real country. It's a kind of geographical appellation. And if you look in old literature, old, I mean 30, 40 years ago, there were several Sudans. For example, what we now call Mali was called by the French le Soudan français, you know? So why? Because in geographical terms, it is not a very precise place. So already there is an ambiguity in what the place is. It is anything in Arabic, anything that stretches from Senegal to Ethiopia, you know, south of the desert. The second point is that this space is culturally fragmented, and then I'm narrowing it to what we call the Sudan today. There are regions in the Sudan that are completely different in population, geography, tribal groupings, you name it. And sub-tribes, because people tend to think that Africa is made of tribes. Oh, that would be wonderful if it were the case. You have a lot of sub-tribes. Take the large tribes in the southern Sudan, for example, the Dinka and the Nuer. You say Dinka, you say Nuer, it's not very useful because you have subgroups that are, for example, the Dinka all by themselves are 3 million. People think a tribe is some kind of a little small group. The Dinka are 3 to 3.5 million, okay? And they spread over an area which is perhaps twice the size of Texas. So of course, you have all kinds of sub-Dinka groups. And at times they don't love each other at all. Not any more than if they were not part of the same tribe. So this is one aspect, the fragmentation. Second aspect, all these groups are hierarchized. In other words, everybody's equal, but some are more equal than others. Huh? You have the groups that are really the masters. And these are the people who are in what I call the golden polygon, which is around Khartoum, going the north to Atbara, south to Kosti, and to the east to Gedaref, to the west to El Obeid. Within that, you have 80% of the banks. You have 80% of the doctors. You have the only paved road in the country. You have the people who run the show, okay? And these are people who think of themselves as Arabs. On top of the hierarchy of the place, they are top dogs. Does it mean that A, they're really Arabs, B, they are really what they think? It is not the case. Because these people, when they go to the real Arab countries, the white Arab countries, they are called themselves Abid. And by the way, there we're entering this notion of the hierarchy, and the vocabulary is essential. The words you use to call people are bullets. And Sudan, which is one of the most racist countries I know in Africa, is full of derogatory vocabulary. And the Arabs who are in that hierarchy, supposed to be at the top, are considered by white Arabs as themselves, well, niggers. Let's be rude. That's the word that, when you say abid in Arabic, it's exactly the equivalent. And when they go to Saudi Arabia, to Syria, to Yemen, this is what they are. So in a way, within that hierarchy, they're on top of the others, but they're not accepted by the people that they pretend to belong to. It's a completely surrealistic situation. I am the boss because I belong to a certain culture, but at the same time, the people who are the essential embodiment of that culture do not recognize me as one of themselves, of theirs, So it obliges the hierarchy to be extremely, and it's not obvious when you don't know the country. When you come to Khartoum, everybody is sweet and nice and polite, People are very gentle. But look at how they deal with the people who are lower than them on the racial hierarchization. And then that is very revealing. Look at how they are in the south. And now we know that it is not a religious question. Look at how they are in Darfur. Because in Darfur, for a long time, people said, they're all Muslims, there cannot be anything. Now I think, unfortunately, we know very well that the problem is not religious, but it's racial. A third characteristic is that everything is dichotomized. Once you have admitted that you're an Arab, or you have managed to sort of upgrade yourself to the status of an Arab, and that is a very, very delicate question, because since the Arabs don't look like Arabs, they don't look like a Lebanese, or they don't look like a Saudi, the question is the perception of your own Arabism. And once you are an Arab, you're in the better category. Although you might not be recognized as an Arab by another group, and you have a kind of permanent jockeying for position. For example, this is very clear in Darfur, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating, or rather the proof of the domination is in the killing. some of the black tribes are trying to become Arabs. And this is very, very clear. For example, in the case of one small tribe on the Chadian border called the Gimr. This is a small tribe. There are perhaps 30 or 40,000 of them. They are keen members of the Janjaweed because they want to be on the good side of the dichotomy. And they are black Africans. But they've decided we speak only Arabic. We are going to become Arabs. And they're in the Janjaweed, which is like a ticket. You have to imagine a group of Jews who would become SS, But we are going to pay our dues. We're going to deny what we are, and we're going to be part of the better group. And unfortunately, in a horrible way, it works. Because since the notion is such a cultural thing, you can decide to change. You can become what you're not, or at least you hope that the masters, the guys who really control the show, will accept you as one of theirs. So a third aspect is that this space has a very strange view of economics. Why so? Because contrary to what people think, the Sudan was not colonized by the British. It was colonized by the Turco-Egyptians. The shape of the country roughly, but this is like an accordion. It has grown very big, grown smaller, grown bigger. It was not. This is why it's not a state. It's not. It's a space which has blown itself much bigger and has shrunk in the 1880s, then regained its present size. Like even Darfur was not part of the Sudan until 1916, till World War I. A lot of people think, Darfur, okay, it's Sudan, yeah, but this is a place that remained independent till World War I and was included very late. Why does it have a strange view of economics? Because, and there, I will not go into that, but those who are interested in the Ottoman Empire will quickly understand what I mean. The notion of economics that the Ottomans carried with them was definitely not one that the IMF and the World Bank would approve. It was a zero-sum game. You have something, I take it from you. The notion of economic growth was completely absent. And this is still the way in which the various governments of the Sudan have seen their own space since 1956. In Sudan, when you say al-hukum, the government, you mean a predatory gang. And by the way, this is not the Muslim Brothers. Yeah, they are like that, but the others were exactly the same. Since 1956, the model of economic exploitation, and I'm deliberately using that word, is a model that harks back to the Ottoman Empire. And in a way, the British never could modify it because without admitting it, the British did the same thing. The British didn't want the Sudan. They didn't want it at all. They got it because they had Egypt. They had to have Egypt because of the Suez Canal. And they had India at the other end. They had to have the Sudan as a back door to it. They did not want it. The main reason was to keep the French out. Fashoda, you've heard the name. Keep the French out. But do we want this place? Not really. So we get it. We have to at least minimize our loss in economic terms. And the whole attitude of the British during the 57-year period that they ran the Sudan was one of minimizing losses on the Ottoman model. That is not really growth. Really grab what you can, squeeze it out. The country is like a giant grapefruit. Squeeze it out of the country and then hope to keep the budget more or less balanced. So that is something today when, there I'm going back to the diplomatic view of things. If you're saying, we are talking with the developmental state, no, you're not. You're talking with a random looting state. For example, the view of the oil economy now is exactly like this. We can go into details if you're interested in asking questions about how do the Sudanese themselves view their own oil resources and how they're using them and what the future holds. This is a highly dangerous view, which has nothing to do with the developmental view of economics. For example, the money that is being squeezed out of the oil is not invested in productive ventures. Most of it, there are one or two things, a little bit unfair in terms of hydroelectric production. But apart from that, most of it is used in prestige things, which is typical of this type of economy. When you squeeze the grapefruit, what you do, you build palaces, you buy race horses or race camels, you do luxury things, on a pattern which has nothing to do with developmental economics. And that is one of the aspects of the culture you have to deal with when you're dealing with the Sudan, the zero-sum game economics. Another aspect that foreigners often do not see, the tremendous impact of the slave trade on the consciousness of the people. And that it is difficult to say, was it racism that caused the slave trade or the existence of the slave trade that embedded racism in the consciousness of the people who are running the trade? This is a chicken and egg kind of question. I'm not sure I can answer it. And I've been in and out of the Sudan now for something like 37 years. So if I still can't answer it, it means it's a hard question to answer. But there is a tremendous division. And when I was talking about this hierarchy, about this sort of a master and slave, and there are masters, slaves, and servants, by the way. Because, the word khadam is, you can talk about tribes, about racial groups by using these words. You have the people who call themselves awlad al-beled, the children of the land, which is a very interesting term. Because if you are a child of the land, then this other guy over there, who is not walad al-beled, what does that make him? Well, that very clearly makes him a second-class citizen, right? So awlad al-beled are the people of the golden polygon at the center of the country, where all the money, the banks, the doctors, and the roads are. And then you have the khadam, the people who are somewhere acceptable. They are Muslims, but they're not real. They're either second-class Arabs like the Arabs from the West, or they're people like the Rashaida, or people like the Beja in the east on the border with Eritrea. They're sort of okay. I mean, you wouldn't marry them. You wouldn't give your daughter in marriage to one of those. But, that's all right. They can clean the house and they can drive your car and, they're not haram. You're not disgusted by touching them. And then you have the others, the Abid. There is a clear distinction between the two. This existence of the slave trade has created a kind of layer of acceptability of population. Because the people who are the khadam, who are not the slaves, but who are not the masters, who are somewhere in between, they were the auxiliaries of the slave trade. If you go back to the 1840s, 50s, 60s, how was the slave trade working? You had the guys who had the money, who assembled the fleets because they all went up the Nile, to run the slave expeditions. And then you had the people who carried the guns, who did the menial tasks, who did the cooking, all these auxiliaries around. And this is still, you know it, and there you have to go back to matrimonial politics. Who is marrying whom? This is why I think culture is so important. Because, you talk to somebody from the State Department, and you say, no, this guy is beyond the pale, because somebody wanted to marry his sister, and the father said this is completely out of the question. The guy from the State Department looks at you and says, what are you talking about? We want to sign a treaty, some kind of a document to make sure that the next elections are going to be run according to benchmarks and this. And the man is a key person, for example, vis-a-vis the electoral process, vis-a-vis the electoral commission. And you say, he has no power. I say, why? He's head of the commission. No, it's not him. It's another guy behind him that you don't realize is the real boss of the commission. The guy you're talking with is just a Radam. He's there for the show. He's there, to look nice and to prove to you, American, that we're not racists. We've got this guy who's not very okay, but he's the chairman of the commission. And in fact, he has no control over what's going on. And he reports, to his real boss, whom you're not going to see, or perhaps he will come and shake your hand, be polite, and disappear. But this is the way it works in terms of people's positioning. And the British did not improve that very much, because they inherited, of course, all what I'm talking about now existed before the British came in 1898. Did they change it? No. Basically, there you have to go back to the fact they didn't want the Sudan. They just got it because they couldn't do any otherwise, and they had to run it. But that meant they wanted to interfere with it as little as possible. The whole point of the British in the Sudan was run the place without a budget deficit. And, at times, when you think of the number of people who were running it, the Sudan, by the way, Sudan was not part of the colonial office. Sudan was not a colony. It was a condominium that was run jointly under the pretense that Egypt was still an independent country, so it was the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. So it depended from the Foreign Office, not from the colonial office. Therefore, all the people who were British civil servants working in the Sudan were not colonial officers. They were Foreign Office people. And the whole Foreign Office cadre for the Sudan, you cannot even believe the figure, 450 people, If you think of a country, 1.5 million square kilometers. For example, the whole of Darfur, and you have memoirs of people who were, foreign office officers in Darfur. The whole of Darfur, which is the size of France, was run by 4 people, 4 administrators. So, basically, the British didn't want to tangle with the country. They didn't want to change it. It was too expensive, too complicated, too much of a headache. So keep it as it is, run it as it is, and all these systems of fragmentation, hierarchy, who is acceptable, who is not acceptable, they didn't want to bother with that. They knew very well, by the way. They were excellent. They were, the typical example is Evans Pritchard. They had this whole group of Foreign Office anthropologists who beautifully knew all that. All what I'm talking about, they were perfectly aware of. And they decided not to tangle with it, not to mess with it. Why not? It's working the way it is. And basically, you had some policies that were schizophrenic, because since they decided not to interfere, it means that various agents could do different things. For example, politically, the Foreign Office was pro-Arab. That was clear. We're dealing with the Turuk, with the brotherhoods, with the Muslim brotherhoods, the main ones. We use them as partners. We play them against each other. We play completely Arab politics. All those blacks in the South, okay, forget it. As said one administrators, they're happy people. Let them sing love songs to their cows. It's not an exaggeration, because among the Dinka, a young boy, when after puberty he gets one cow, this cow is his companion. She follows him like a dog everywhere. And people have a special relationship with the cattle. And these colonial administrators, these are happy people. It's a kind of Rousseauist vision of the happy savage, singing love song to his cows. We're not dealing politics with these guys. We're dealing politics with the serious people, that is the Muslim brotherhoods in the north. But at the same time, you had the missionaries. And of course, the missionaries knew very well they could not penetrate Islam. There's no way you can convert a Muslim. So the missionaries thought, okay, we've got those Southerners. And they just dove. It was really on the South. Of course, with the best of intentions. But they exaggerated even the gap between the people who would be the object of the tender ministrations of the missionaries, and those other people were handled politically in a much more sophisticated and abstract way by the Foreign Office. So the missionaries, and then another added complication, most of the missionaries were Catholics. Why? Because the administrators did not like Protestants. Because the Protestants, they had ways of having recourse to people in London. The Catholics were powerless in London. You know, I mean, when you have Catholic missionaries, they cannot do anything. So there were a bunch of Italians and Americans, Americans of Irish origin. You know, the Mill Hill Fathers or the Fratelli Comboniani, you know, were from Verona. And they were the main missionaries in the South, making it even more heterogeneous. Because can you imagine a bunch of Muslims who are treated with great dignity by the British and so on, and then at the other end, a bunch of black people, Christians, Catholics, who were living in another world. It was like an Italian colony, you know? And of course, the people loved it in London because it meant that if there was any kind of problem, you know, these Comboniani brothers, what could they do in London? They could not bother the local colonial administrator. You know, there's no way they could intervene. So the British intervention did not change these patterns. I would even say, on the contrary, it probably reinforced them because it gave them a kind of, you know, very acceptable way, you know, the white man's imprint. You know, all these things are fine. You know, we don't have to touch them. And at the same time, some people had their own idiosyncrasies. In the South, all forms of Arabism was forbidden. To the point, I mean, not only was it forbidden for dawah, for the you know, the preaching of Islam to the Southerners, but it was even what I would call, you know, what we used to call petty apartheid when we were talking about South Africa in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, they're absolutely amusing things. For example, it was forbidden for tailors to produce clothes without collars, because this was jalabiya, you know. And the tailors were prohibited to sew clothes that had an Arabic look. So the Southerners not only were left to the tender ministrations of a bunch of Italian Catholics, but they should not wear the same clothes as the Northerners. So was it that the British were pro-Northern or anti-Northern? It depended on who you were talking with. Because since in London nobody cared, basically the guys on the ground followed their little impulses. And the Southern policy was very keen. It was till 1947, you could not wear Arabic-type clothes in the South, without any reason or explanation, or it was just a rule, an administrative rule, and tailors would follow it. Otherwise, they would be fined, you know, saying you cannot do that. So the British policy was rather schizophrenic. And in the end, they sold the South. You know, all these Christians, and so they sold them. Why did they sell them? For the Suez Canal zone. Because at the time, around independence, and there again, you have this intrusion of the Western vision of what the Sudan is. It's an object. I mean, all these little facts that I'm giving you about how people actually behave, felt, lived, loved, got married, wanted this, didn't want that. When you talk about diplomacy, it's gone, finished, dead, flat. And the name of the game in 1954, 55, 56 was the Suez Canal. Why? Because the Egyptians remembered that, hey, we are the old rulers of the Sudan. Before the Brits came, you know, like between 1821 and 1885, we were the rulers. Then there was the myth of the condominium. We shared the Sudan with the Brits. Now the Brits are walking out. We want our Sudan back. And in Cairo, even today, when I go to Cairo, I still get people, you know, especially in the Ministry of Defense, especially in the Secret Service, the military Secret Service, who say, we are going to have to intervene in the Sudan one day, because these guys cannot govern themselves. And anyway, it's ours. And even today, you would be surprised, you know, under the Mubarak administration. I've had this kind of talk the last time about 3 years ago. We have to take it over again. So, at the time, the problem of the British was, what can we do in order to keep the Suez Canal zone? And one of the things the Egyptians were asking was, we want the Sudan as a whole. We want a complete Sudan, north and south, because water-wise, and of course when you talk about the Sudan, for the Egyptian it's, you know, al-moya, al-moya, al-moya bas, water, eh? They say we want it whole, because we want to be sure we control the whole line of that water all the way from the lake, from Lake Victoria to our border. And the Brits said, okay, we will keep the Sudan together instead of breaking it down, because with 1.5 million square kilometers, with this heterogeneity, with this problem of relationship between the people, you could reasonably have conceived of some kind of a, perhaps at least two different countries, you know, and perhaps there is a missing country between Uganda and the Sudan, because when you see all the wars in Uganda with between North and South, perhaps, you know, it would have been better if there had been a third country between Uganda and the Sudan. And the Brits said, no, we will keep for you guys, we will keep it, Sudan as one piece. Later you'll take it, you know, you'll pocket it, but you let us stay in the Suez Canal zone. But you know, sin is never rewarded. They lost it a year later with the Suez operation of '56. Now, today, what can we do when we look at the Sudan as it is since 1989? All the traits that I have mentioned are still present. And by the way, this is one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're dealing with General Bashir. He is an incarnation of all these things in the Sudan, much more than something new. You know, the guy calls himself and the people around him Islamists, and, you know, we are, you know, part of, you know, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, you know, of a new dispensation, you know, in the country. I'm not so sure that this is the right way of looking at it. Bashir and the people around him are much more the last incarnation of the various traits I've been talking about. All this deconnection between the groups, this hierarchization, this domination of some vis-a-vis the others, this cultural embodiment of, yes, this is acceptable, no, this is not acceptable, this kind of soft cultural racism that is diffused in all of Sudanese society. And Islam is much more a way of legitimizing this system of hierarchy, domination, fragmentation. In a way, this would be much more difficult to do for a democratic, secular government. The moment you talk about a secular democratic government, you say one man, one vote, you know, I mean, whether these guys, he's black or Arab, or whether he's a Muslim or a Christian, or he's from Darfur, or he's from the center, or he's Beja, or it's all the same. In many ways, democracy is the base for the possibility of considering all men not only as equal, but also as interchangeable, which is definitely not the way the Sudanese see themselves. They're not interchangeable. I mean, some are in this position, some are in this position. It is not India. We're not talking about a caste system. But we're talking about large social groups, their interaction, and do not forget what I said about the zero-sum game in economic terms. Who is going to have the right to squeeze the grapefruit, right? And if you take Islam as a legitimizing factor, then you are in a tremendously favorable position, because you say, we do not represent us ourselves, Awlad al-Beled, we do not represent the masters of the country, we represent the people who best incarnate the law of God. This is much better than to say we want to squeeze the grapefruit and we want to keep control of the economy because we are the inheritors of the people who have run this country from, you know, since the time it existed, carved itself out of the Al-Beled Sudan. And, you know, you know, I love popular wisdom and the street language. In Khartoum, when people talk about the present regime, they don't call them Muslim brothers, they don't call them Islamists, they have a much better term. And by the way, when I met Osama bin Laden, because I met him in 1993 in Khartoum, I tried that word on him to see if he would jump. You know, the expression is al-tujar ad-din, the merchants of religion, which is perfect. It's beautiful. It's the reality. We are the bosses. We use Islam, and through Islam, we keep the profit. And you know, I did not know Osama bin Laden was any kind of special person. I had been persona non grata for the past 4 years because I had written all kinds of nasty things about the Muslim Brothers before they came to power. So after '89, I could not get a visa anymore. But then in '93, I wrote an article saying that Hassan al-Turabi was by far the most intelligent politician in the Horn of Africa. And this was in Le Monde Diplomatique, and he reads French. So he said, oh, a very perceptive man. Why don't we see him more often here? And they said, no, sir, you don't understand. The man is horrible. He's a hateful character. And so Turabi said, no, you don't understand tahaluf. Tahaluf means, you know, the capacity of adapting, of being a good tactical person and knowing how to make compromises. So they gave me a phone call and they said, why don't you come back to Khartoum? So, okay, I went. I was not PNG anymore. I'm PNG again now. You know, it goes up and down. That's life. When I arrived, I hadn't been in Khartoum for 4 years. I say, you know, what's new? What should I do? And I was given a list of things to do and people to meet. And a friend said, you should meet that bizarre guy who's coming from Saudi Arabia. He's some kind of Yemenite family, you know, but he's all living over in Riyadh. And so I asked for an audience. And you know, he gave me an audience. It was very gracious. And his English was much better than my Arabic. So we ended up speaking English. You know, after a while, you know, I could get a little bit freer with him. And I knew he had political asylum kind of by the Sudanese government. And he started complaining about the Sudanese government. He said, these people are not real Muslims. You know, I know it doesn't tag with your perception here. He says, they're not people I would really consider serious Muslims. And if we want an Islamic state, frankly, they're not my ideal. And then I said, okay, I'll try. Maybe he'll throw me out. And I say, you know how people call them here? And he laughed and he said, I know, tujar ad-din. You know, so, I mean, it was so obvious that, you know, the notion that who they were was not what even they said they were within the country, and that popular wisdom could see through the pretense that they were trying to establish. And this gives us now a tremendous difficulty with the policy approach of how foreigners, you, me also, can deal, but except I have no power. Americans do, a little bit. How can they deal with that phenomenon? Because, and there I'm going to get very personal and perhaps a little bit offensive, but when I see General Gratian saying, as he did on September 29th in the Washington Post, you can deal with governments like you deal with children. You give them cookies and smileys, and then they engage with you. I'm afraid that there is, you know, this is the heart of the misperception, because there is a need of getting a normal situation in the Sudan. The US administration, this one, as well as the previous one and the previous one, has been running since 1989, wants to normalize the Sudan. And the Sudan keeps insisting on being what it is. I'm not saying, by the way, that one is right, the other is wrong. It's what I'm trying to get at, and I hope perhaps I've made some progress in that direction, is the misfit. Trying to get a square peg into a round hole. I mean, maybe you can decide these guys are evil, or these are better, or we're right, they're wrong, or perhaps you can say they have excuses. Forget about that. This is judgmental. This is not value-free at all. I'm just saying, in technical terms, what is the nature of the relationship? And by wanting to see a country that is horribly complicated, or a space, horribly complicated, with the eyes of the person who wants to get, like you're like mechanics. You say, I want that engine to run. And the parts that you're trying to handle do not correspond to the catalog that you have bought from the manufacturer. They're different. And you say, how can I put that bloody engine together? And of course, the parts insist on being weird. And you say, but according to my views, they should not be like that, they should be like this. And there is a real problem. Because in a way, the only way to deal with a country like that, and there again, I think it goes beyond the Sudan. I mean, I think there are other countries like that. And I'm just thinking of what is happening in Iran now with some of the problems between ethnic minorities and Persians. And by the way, remember, they're only about 60% Farsi native speakers in Iran, This is one of these horrible situations where you think, okay, we know how this engine should run, but the engine is not running the way you want because the parts are not the ones you think they are. And the only way is to nativize yourself, to go native. And I already had this big discussion back in 1995 in Princeton after the collapse of Operation Restore Hope in Somalia. When everybody came running from Somalia, I say, it doesn't work. And I say, go native. Go native or leave. You cannot force Somali to be democratic Americans. You cannot force Sudanese to be. You cannot force Iranians to be. Now, does it mean you have to work exactly like them? No, of course not, because you have your own interest, you have your own purposes, you have your own goals. The question is the tools. How are you going to do that? Are you going to do it by pretending that your vis-a-vis, the person you're speaking with, you're dealing with, is like you? And give him a few cookies and smileys, and eventually he will shape up and work the way. Nope, it ain't gonna work that way. Because the people that you're dealing with have hundreds and hundreds of years of cultural, it's like hair transplant or something. But it was a long time ago. It's the roots are in, and they are not going to change simply. Of course, if you say we're gonna nuke you, then of course, anybody will reconsider. But short of that, if it is a sort of halfway house where a number of processes are to happen, either you take it from the position that the people are in, which of course can mean pushing all kinds of nasty buttons, because as I said, it's fragmented, it's hierarchized, it's dichotomized, but it would make a lot more sense to support what I would say native or forces to change the situation from the inside, rather than to come and say, we are going to reason on the basis of our categories and somehow we're going to reach some kind of an agreement. The question is, where do these categories start? Where do they end?